Welcome to Public History of 35W. We're really glad that you all are joining us. Before we begin, I'll cover a few WebEx basics here. All attendees are muted and video is disabled upon entry to preserve bandwidth during the meeting. Please utilize the chat box, which you can click on in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to type in comments or questions throughout the session, and be sure to send your comments or questions to everyone or all panelists. This will help us have a good discussion tonight. Questions will be answered after the presentation during the Q&A session. If you experience any technical difficulties, please call or text Kurt at 319-238-3413, or you can send him an email at kurt.beringer@hdrinc.com. So with that, I will pass it off to Denise.
Thank you so much. Good evening and welcome to our event tonight, A Public History of 35W, New Research. My name is Denise Pike, and I'm a public historian here in the Twin Cities and the co-lead of A Public History of 35W. Tonight's event is co-hosted by Hennepin History Museum, Minnesota Department of Transportation, and the Heritage Studies and Public History program at the University of Minnesota. Our presenters for the evening are Jacob Noble, Jessica Carter, and Kas Fowler, students in the Heritage Studies and Public History program. They will be joined by Greg Donofrio, professor in the Heritage Studies and Public History program and co-lead of the Public History of 35W project. Sophie Hunt from Hennepin History Museum will be helping to moderate our Q&A session, and Eric Backstrom from the Minnesota Department of Transportation will be on hand to answer any questions about the recent 35W construction work. A Public History of 35W is a collaboration between members of the South Minneapolis community and students and faculty at the Heritage Studies and Public History Master's Program. The goal of the project is to understand the history of 35W from a community perspective. The freeway is something that's easy to overlook or take for granted, and we might not think very critically of it as we drive along it. And because it's such a big piece of infrastructure and takes up such a large amount of space, it's tempting to think that it's always been there or that it's natural for the freeway to be there. But of course, it wasn't always there. It was planned in the mid-1950s, and the construction began in 1962. And the stretch from 94 to Highway 62 opened in just 1968. And there's some things that we want to know. What was it like to lose a home and to be forced out of the freeway's path? Where did people go once they were displaced? How has 35W changed the neighborhoods of South Minneapolis? How did the freeway affect Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And how were their experiences different from or similar to white residents of South Minneapolis? These are just some of our many questions, and we don't have all the answers. In fact, we're going to need your help to answer these and other questions about 35W. Historical archives that include documents and old newspaper articles don't say a lot about how the community and people in the neighborhoods of South Minneapolis experienced and continue to experience the freeway. And we're hoping that some of you tuning in tonight will be able to share your stories and perspectives with us. Our plan is to develop an online archive of oral histories and stories about 35W in South Minneapolis. And we plan to open a public exhibition about this work at Hennepin History Museum in fall 2021, so just about a year from now. And between now and then, we'll be hosting some other events for you to get involved in and to learn more about what we're finding through our research. You may have seen some of our presentations in the past. We've presented on some of the details surrounding the construction of 35W, the condemnation process, the broader context of racial housing discrimination, and how that made it difficult for Black residents displaced by the freeway to relocate. Next slide, please. Tonight, you'll be hearing a presentation about the story of one family in particular, the Taylor family, whose home was in the path of 35W. We'll follow the story of Marion G. Taylor, his wife Mary, and his son Greg, and we'll contextualize their experiences within the history of the freeway, the local fight for open housing legislation, and race relations in the city as well as the suburbs. At the end of our presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, comments, or anything that you'd like to share, please utilize the chat function and we'll have a discussion afterwards. And if you'd like to get in contact with us, our contact email and website can be found on the bottom of the slides. And before we jump into this presentation, Sophie from our partner Hennepin History Museum is going to say a few words.
Thank you, Denise. As Denise said, my name is Sophie Hunt. I'm Public Programs Manager at Hennepin History Museum, and I just want to give a warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the museum. I know we had a little bit of competition tonight, so I see a lot of people signing on now, and we're happy to have you with us during what continues to be a challenging year for us and for so many other communities. As Denise said, this event is part of an ongoing partnership between Hennepin History Museum, the Heritage Studies and Public History Program, and the Minnesota Department of Transportation, which started about a year ago when our three organizations got together and decided to do a historical walking tour of 35W. Denise and Greg Donofrio and some graduate students in the Heritage Studies and Public History program had spent the summer doing some very preliminary research on the construction of the freeway, resistance to the freeway, and what it's been like for people on the South Side to live with the freeway since the 1960s. And so that walking tour was a chance for them to start sharing that research with the public. And we've continued to hold events periodically to check in as this project has grown to have an expanded focus, new topics, new researchers, community advisors, and many more community members sharing their story. And because of COVID, a lot of those events have been online. So if you missed them, we'll put some links in the chat so that you can catch up on some earlier chapters of this project. But we feel really honored to be a partner in this project. We are really excited about the exhibit that will open at our museum in fall of 2021. And we also recognize that in some ways the story for us begins before a year ago. It actually begins in fall of 2018 when Denise and Casey Lucchini, who were both graduate students in the HSPH program then, curated an exhibit at Hennepin History Museum called Owning Up: Racism and Housing in Minneapolis. That exhibit was the first place for many people in Hennepin County that they saw a redlining map, these color-coded maps that we've become more familiar with now and that I'm sure we'll see tonight, as well as started to hear stories of the prejudice and even violence that some Black families encountered when they tried to move into predominantly white neighborhoods in our city. And this story of the freeway is an obvious next chapter in the story for us. And I think you'll agree as you continue to watch this presentation. So I want to thank Denise and Greg and the rest of the team for being here. Thank you all again for coming. And please do put questions in the chat at any point during the presentation. I'll be watching and will help moderate the Q&A when the presentation's over. Thanks a lot. Jacob, I'll turn it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we hope to tell you a story about a family that lived here in the Twin Cities and felt the effects firsthand of many of the forces we're going to talk about today, and I've talked a lot about in the past. I want to be upfront right now, not a complete story. There are details that we just don't know yet. Sense we have to tie up, and it's a story that, even though we know the beginning and the end, we're still not sure we know all of. I'm sure that's going to be frustrating for some of you listening, and I just want to let you know that it's something that frustrates us too and something we hope to learn more about as we continue our research. And I'm telling you this because I hope you can help us tell more stories like this in the future. I'm going to jump somewhere to the middle of our story. It's January 4th, 1960. Next slide. The village of Morningside is having a village meeting. The topic turned recent property purchase in the village, the currently empty lot at 4209 Scott Terrace. Some residents are agitated about this purchase, questioning the legitimacy of it, and asked what the village attorney and council could do to stop it. One particularly angry resident suggested the lot would serve the village better as a drainage ditch than a new house. All this ire may seem perplexing. Why would residents of the community be so opposed to a new neighbor? The answer comes to the heart of issues we have been researching here at A Public History of 35W. Next slide, please. Marion G. Taylor, a Black man, was attempting to purchase a lot in Morningside, which is now a part of Edina. Taylor, along with his wife Mary and son Greg, were three of many thousands of people staring a massive problem in the face. Where do you move if a freeway destroys your home? Where do you go when your neighborhood is being destroyed? Nobody knows exactly how many people were displaced by freeway construction in the Twin Cities. Interstate Highway Act of 1956, which provided funds to build Interstates 94 and 35W, didn't require states to keep data about displacement. It also didn't provide any funding for relocation services or moving expenses. The Minnesota of Highways did, however, keep careful track of how many properties it had to acquire to build the freeways. Multiplying the number of times the average number of people per property, it's estimated that 7,000 people would be displaced by freeways in St. Paul and 24,000 in Minneapolis. The Taylors were one of these families that were displaced. Next slide, please. The Taylors were informed in late 1959 that they would have to move home at 3833 Stevens Avenue by the middle of 1960. Because their home was demolished, we don't know exactly what it looked like. Such as these on Stevens Avenue give us a good guess. Since 1954 or 55, Mary got married. Before Mary had lived a full and eventful life. His life shows us many of the social and political trends we understand about the United States and Twin Cities, but can sometimes struggle to put to individual lives. Next slide, please. Marion Taylor was born in 1918 in Memphis, Tennessee. What we know about him is largely constructed from just a few sources. His family were farmers just outside Memphis, and Marion bounced between schools a bit, and he served in the military during World War II. What we can see from these scant sources is something that research backs up. Racism and prejudice. I'm turning off my video. Yeah, just seeing the message now. Racism and prejudice a shadow over his entire life. For example, almost all of Marion's education before graduate school was segregated, and he had to change schools based on their ability to support different programs. While he was in the military, despite being qualified for high-level positions, Marion was always under the command of a better compensated and less educated white officer. After he left in 1946, Marion did some graduate school in Iowa. In 1949, he moved to Minnesota, where he worked, continued graduate school for a time, and met his wife. Next slide, please. I will interject here that we don't know as much about Marion's wife, as we do about him. Most of our sources about the Taylors come from the earlier mid-20th century, and if any voice for them is specified, it is almost always Marion's. We do know that Mary herself was educated, a teacher and social worker with several graduate degrees. She was working in the Minneapolis public schools system in 1960. Unfortunately, beyond some of these details, we don't know much more about Mary. Our hope is that by continuing to research this story, we can learn more about her as well. When he first moved to Minneapolis, he lived in near North. He described the location along 7th Street, just about where Target Field is now. Places like Rondo, near North, and Old South Side became hubs for African Americans living in the Twin Cities. Near North, for example, was home to a large percentage of the African American population of Minneapolis since the early 1900s. The area was also home to a large number of Jewish residents, although this group increasingly moved to the suburbs during the middle of the 20th century. Next slide, please. What made places like near North, Rondo hubs for African Americans in the Twin Cities was the services the community was able to provide. Beyond other African American residents, social services, clubs, and churches, businesses abounded in these neighborhoods, providing both community and financial stability for residents. Next slide, please. And this is not to say that these neighborhoods came from an exclusively positive experience. Marion Taylor's choice to move to near North might not have been a choice as much as the only option. People of color in Minneapolis were often barred from living in most places in the city and most suburbs as well. Restrictive covenants were written into property deeds to prevent houses from ever being owned or rented by people of color. All across Minneapolis, many properties had restrictive covenants placed on them, and some entire neighborhoods were off limits for racial and religious and ethnic minorities. Neighborhoods like near North became centers of Black or Jewish population because, in some cases, they were the only places people could find homes. Next slide, please. Marion lives near the current Target Field site. This is the challenge of telling these stories, that many of the places we hope to use to tell the story are gone. We try to tell as much as we can with what remains for us. One exciting development I do want to mention is that later next month, we're going to interview members of Marion's family who are still with us. And we hope that this conversation can shed light on his family's story and help us to continue telling it in the best way we can. Next slide, please. When Marion and Mary got married in 1954 or 55, he's not clear about the exact date, they moved to South Minneapolis. This trajectory from near North to Old South Side is one many other families took. Old South Side was often seen as a middle-class, Black or integrated neighborhood. The move to South Minneapolis would have been common for people in Marion and Mary's situation. Next slide. The young couple, soon joined by son Greg, owned a home at 833 Stevens Avenue. In an interview after the fact, Marion sounds proud of the place they had. His house had a lot of space, a big front yard and backyard. You could see, he said, all the way to 394 and all the way to the Capitol. I've been trying to imagine what his line of sight must have been to see that far, and I can really only think he must have climbed on his roof to be able to. Slide, please. Mary tried doors and doors made of dark maple wood. He mentioned several times the house was by Maurice Rothschild, who, as best as I can tell, was a local wholesaler. So perhaps Marion bought fittings there and built the house to some extent himself. Marion was located at the heart of a neighborhood and close to several Black businesses and community institutions. He was, above all, clearly proud of this house and where he lived. By almost definition of the term, Marion had achieved the American dream. He owned a house for himself and his family. He had a good job at the VA hospital, and he served his country in the war. And now he looked like he was coming out on the other side more prosperous and successful, despite everything thrown at him. Next slide, please. Fortunately, it didn't last. In 1950, the Taylor family was informed by the state that their house was in the path for 35W. The highway would cut between 2nd Avenue and Stevens Avenue, and the Taylor's property was one of the ones that would be taken for the project. Next slide, please. If you'll permit me, I'd like to take a brief moment to unpack the process the Taylors would have gone through when their house was condemned for freeway construction. Once the Minnesota Highway Department and the Bureau of Public decided on the route for 35W and determined which properties would be in its path, the State Highway Department collected data on the size and description of the house and notified the owners that condemnation proceedings would take place in court. An initial court hearing offered their only chance to petition the state that taking their property was not in the public interest. In practice, though, proving that this, for something like a freeway, that their property was not in the public interest was more or less impossible. According to letters he sent to State Attorney General Walter Mondale, Marion Taylor attended some of these hearings and asked about any relocation committee or aid the state might have in finding new places to live for those who were displaced. No such committee existed. initial court hearing, the presiding judge appointed 3 commissioners who reviewed physical details of the house and compared it to other independent sales in the neighborhood. The highway department also made its own while this determination was being done. Court hearing, the owner was invited to explain to the commission what they felt their property was worth, and the highway department was allowed to cross-examine them during this time. Once the commission made its final determination, they filed with the court, meaning legally the state now owned the property. Owners and highway department had 40 days to appeal the decision, with owners generally appealing for a higher valuation and the highway department for a lower one. If no one appealed, the owners received checks full assessed amount. If someone did appeal, they received 75% of that amount immediately, with future court dates used to negotiate anything else up or down. This process could take anywhere from 8 months to several years, depending on how many appeals were filed. The property, again, as soon as the commissioners filed their report with the court, it offered to rent it back to its former owners, like the Taylors, until it had been demolished for construction. I explained this to help illustrate what the Taylor family was up against. This process was long, complicated, and mostly one-sided. At very few points could the property owner directly question the highway department or the court without getting their own appraisal done. And without getting their own appraisal done, meaningfully changing the ruling was quite difficult. That, as Marion Taylor pointed out in his letter to Walter Mondale, the state did not have any office devoted to helping those displaced find new places to live. And I think at this point, we're going to talk a little bit about open housing and some of the legal background for that.
Thanks, Jacob, for that story on the Taylors, and I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about open occupancy and what is called the racial problem. Next slide, please. Freeway planners and elected officials knew it would be difficult for Black people displaced by the freeway to find other places to live. In March of 1957, Minnesota Highway Commissioner Loyal Zimmerman wrote to Governor Orville Freeman to tell him about an issue that had emerged as property acquisition was beginning in St. Paul for Interstate 94, which was a couple of years ahead of the 35W project. The freeway would run through Rondo, Zimmerman explained. The area, quote, contains 1,400 families whose homes would be taken, and involved also is the complication of 700 of these being owned by Negro families, where we have the additional racial problem to solve, end quote. Next slide. Zimmerman didn't define the problem in that memo, but correspondence Governor Freeman received in the following months, like this letter from the NAACP, made matters clear. Quote, I am sure that the State Highway Department did not consider the relocation problems confronting these Black people. The discriminatory practices of certain groups have these persons confined to only seek relocation in the fringe areas of the so-called ghetto. Prices in the fringe areas have gone up in anticipation of frantic buying, and these persons affected by the freeway are caught up in this vicious vice. Next slide. And it's not like this was unknown outside of the Black community. It was blatantly quoted in the Star Tribune. This article from the September 1958 quoted the director of the Minneapolis Urban League, who said, there's an acute housing shortage for Negroes in the city simply because housing is about the only commodity a Negro can't buy on an open market. Next slide. Organizations like the Urban League, the NAACP, and other advocates for racial equality sought to address the problem by creating open housing. Open housing refers to the goal of a unitary housing market in which a person's background, as opposed to their financial resources, does not arbitrarily restrict access, that any citizen, regardless of race, religion, their national origin, is entitled to have available housing. There were 2 strategies to pursue the goal of open housing. One, to build new housing that was available to all buyers, And 2, to pass open housing laws at the local, state, and national levels that would prohibit racial discrimination in housing. Next slide. But building new housing was incredibly difficult and rarely successful. Nationally, an estimated 8,000 open housing units had been built between 1946 and 1955. And out of a total of over 10 million housing units overall, the Minneapolis Star reported that an estimated 2% of new housing units, about 20,000, were available to people of color nationally. Next slide, please. In Minneapolis, Black entrepreneur Archie Givens recruited developer Edward Tilson in 1954 to build some of the nation's first privately developed open housing in the entire United States. 44 of these Tilsenbilt homes were built on scattered sites throughout South Minneapolis, between 33rd Street and 46th Street, primarily along Clinton, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Avenues. About 90% of them were purchased by Black buyers. Next slide, please. In 1954, the Minneapolis spokesman described Tilsenbilt Homes as one of the most important housing programs affecting the Negro community in the history of Minneapolis. If you'd like to learn more about the Tilsenbilt history, I encourage you to read Heidi Adelsman's definitive article about the project, which was recently republished in the Hennepin History Museum's website. Next slide. Projects like the Minneapolis Tilsenbilt Homes were rare. A national survey of open housing projects in the 1950s found that space for open housing developments was hard to find due to opposition from white-dominated communities. Developers had much difficulty finding financing and had to resort to not telling lenders that the development would be open to all potential buyers. This challenge in attracting residents could sometimes be difficult due to distrust from prospective Black residents and fear from potential white residents. Next slide, please. The second path to open housing was creating laws that would prohibit discrimination in housing on the basis of race. This issue remained in the news in the late 1950s as the NAACP and Urban League pressed local officials and the Hennepin County Board of Realtors to support passage of such laws. Next slide, please. In St. Paul, the NAACP formed a committee to support an open housing ordinance. Passage of an ordinance was critical, the NAACP believed, because so many Black people were about to be displaced by urban renewal and freeway construction projects. Next slide, please. However, both of the Twin Cities resisted. In the 1957 the Minneapolis City Attorney declared such laws unconstitutional because they interfered with the rights of individuals to buy, sell, and rent property as they saw fit. 2 years later, the St. Paul City Attorney reached the same conclusion. The proposed ordinance would be unconstitutional. Neither seemed to have considered the rights of people of color to live wherever they chose. Next slide, please. Statewide, elected officials were divided on the question of open housing. In 1957, the Minnesota State Legislature declared that discrimination based on race, color, creed, religion, national origin, or ancestry was a state concern, but it eroded the foundations of democracy. It declared the opportunity to buy, acquire, lease, and occupy housing to be a civil right, and it created a commission to study the problem, composed of 5 members of the House and 5 members of the Senate. Over the next 2 years, the commission heard testimony, studied anti-discrimination laws in other states, and drafted an anti-housing discrimination law for Minnesota, based on one recently passed in New York State. Next slide, please. In its final report published in 1959, the members of the Legislative Interim Commission on Housing Discrimination and Segregation Practices all agreed that public education was needed to end discrimination and encouraged school systems and the State Board of Education to develop programs on human relations. The commissioners failed to reach agreement on the need for legislation. 5 of them voted against it, 4 of them for it, and 1 abstained. The 5 who voted against it wrote in the report that much of the present friction in housing can be avoided if the Negro people can recognize the need for and actually practice great patience. The solution to so complex a problem as discrimination in housing is not easy, nor can it take place overnight. Attempts at a quick and easy solution of the problem are likely to bring suffering to the entire community, Negro and white alike. Off the record, one of the commission members referred to open housing laws as communist doctrine. Next slide, please. And Governor Freeman, who knew about the racial problem with freeway construction, failed to advocate for a solution on open housing laws by saying, "I hope legislation in this field won't be necessary," in a speech to suburban officials in 1958. Quote, "You all know I'm against segregation," end quote. Next slide, please. But instead of passing laws, political leaders hoped educational materials like this pamphlet would win the hearts and the minds of white Minnesotans with appeals to their sense of morals, their belief in the American dream, and their respect for the US Constitution. Next slide, please. In 1962, Minnesota passed the Fair Housing Law. This law prohibited discrimination based on color, race, creed, religion, or national origin in real estate transactions involving owners, real estate agents, brokers, banks, and salesmen. However, there were two critical loopholes to this law. The first one exempted rentals where part of the dwelling was owner occupied. The second example of sale of privately owned single-family homes without government financing, such as mortgages from the Federal Housing Administration or the Veterans Administration. Open housing advocates estimated that because 60 to 75% of single-family housing market was exempt from the law, not surprisingly, most of those single homes that were publicly assisted were being built in the suburbs since 1945. So the single-family dwellings that were located in Minneapolis and the area around the freeway were likely not protected from discrimination under the 1962 law. Next slide, please. Then, in 1968, President Johnson signed the National Fair Housing Act into law. The purpose of this act was to expressly ban many of the public actions and private practices that had evolved over the years to deny Black people access to housing. This act also outlawed the refusal to rent, sell someone based on race. It prohibited racial discrimination in terms and conditions of rental or sale. It barred discrimination in real estate advertising. It banned agents from making untrue statements about a dwelling's availability in order to deny access to Blacks, and it enjoined real estate agents from making Unlike the Minnesota law, there were no exemptions, which is good. Seen as a catalyst for progress, the Fair Housing Act was supposed to end housing discrimination altogether. But I want you all to think about the neighborhoods in which you live. Even though it has been a little over 50 years since the Fair Housing Act, are there still problems in our society that the Act of 1968 was trying to mend? Are they still at work clandestinely and remain in the patchwork of our cities? And now I'm going to turn it over to Kas.
So Marion, he had to look for a new place for his family, and he had to do it relatively alone. He was like a fit. Marion bought a lot in Morningside, Edina in late 1959. He hoped to build a house there as soon as winter weather passed. If only things could have been so easy. It was, at that time, an all-white community. Members of the village got wind of Marion's purchase and, at a village meeting in January of 1960, voiced concerns about his move there. As much as they tried to frame these concerns as anything else, the racist motivation shone through. White people in Morningside questioned if the proper paperwork had been filed, if a new house was what the village needed on that empty lot. One person even went to suggest a drainage ditch would serve them better than a house. Next slide. Animosity is stark and disheartening, if not necessarily surprising. What makes it even more disheartening, however, is the land Morningside was built on. When Edina was at that time encompassed the entire area as it does now, was founded in the late 1800s, it was done so by a racially mixed group of Black and white farmers. The founders were motivated by a vision of living and working together in harmony. This idea made the community something truly unique and progressive for its time. Examples of such an idea being conceived and acted upon are rare. Unfortunately, much of the progress this group made was lost through the years, as were bought and developed, often into properties that were covenanted, restricting occupancy to only white residents. One thing I do want to note is that recently the city of Edina moved to name a park after the Yancey family, a Black family who was one of the founders of Edina back in the day, which is hopefully a sign of some good progress and acknowledgement of this history going forward. But if any of history was known in January of 1960, the residents of Morningside didn't necessarily show it. What we saw instead was some resistance to this move.
All right, next slide, please. So it's no surprise the Taylors faced opposition in Morningside and that politicians were reluctant to back open housing. Both local and national surveys starting in the 1940s showed there was concern from white residents about Black families moving into what they thought of as their exclusively white neighborhoods. Not every survey is included here because we're still investigating them, but these show some context for the open housing legislation discussed by Jessica earlier. To start, we need to go back to 1943. Next slide, please. The Minnesota governor set up an interracial commission in 1943, which was intended to both educate the public and inform government policy about racial injustice. They created a series of publications, including one in 1946, on Black Minnesotans' experiences in housing. As part of this survey, the Minnesota Poll conducted a survey in the spring of that year with a series of 9 questions intended to gauge public attitudes towards living in proximity to Black Minnesotans. The results of 3 of those questions are highlighted here. The leftmost question asked whether Black people should be allowed to live in any neighborhood, provided they could afford to do so. The majority of respondents did not think they should be allowed that same freedom as their white neighbors, with only 30% believing it should be allowed. The center question asked what effect a Black family moving in might have on the value of their home. 64% believed it would decrease property values. An additional 4% believed a Black neighbor would make their home worthless or completely ruin it. None of the respondents felt their home value would increase. And the final question highlighted on this slide asked whether respondents would sell their home to a Black family if they knew they could get a better selling price, and they still would choose not to do so. Next slide. Oh, not next slide. Sorry. The report in this survey concluded it was disturbing and distressing that attitudes were so poor, but the authors believed that education would change social attitudes and did not offer any legislative recommendations. Next slide. Around the same time that the Minnesota Interracial Commission was conducting this survey, Minneapolis set up their own Council for Human Relations. They were tasked with a similar mission and did their own research, and planned for a community self-survey in late 1946 in partnership with the American Missionary Association's Department of Race Relations. The survey looked at both realtors and public opinions toward different minority groups in Minneapolis. This is the real estate results. A total of 77 real estate firms participated, which was about 1/5 of the real estate firms practicing in the city at the time. 25% of those firms would not sell homes to Black buyers, with an additional 45% only selling to them if the home was in an already identified Black area, such as the near north where Marion Taylor lived when he first came to Minnesota. Half of the realtors surveyed would not rent to Black people for any reason, and 45% would not finance new homes, further restricting their access to home ownership. When asked whether any of these firms were using racial covenants in their new developments that they were promoting, 40% of the respondents were promoting housing that had those covenants. There were systemic barriers for Black people to obtain housing in Minneapolis, even as back as 1947. The report found responses for why these policies existed from the real estate firms too varied to summarize. However, public opinion was a factor in at least some of those cases. Next slide. The public opinion part of this surveyed both property owners and renters in the city, as well as people who were seeking housing, and they did a pretty broad survey of that as well. Residents and prospective residents surveyed in 1947 overall did not want open housing in their neighborhoods. When asked whether they would object to a minority, in this case referring to Black, Asian, or Jewish neighbors, 68% of residents and 87% of prospective residents found the idea objectionable. In addition, 70% of prospective residents, people looking to buy homes in the city, wanted to find housing that had racial covenants restricting who could live in their neighborhood. These surveys took place in the heart of the post-war housing crisis in Minneapolis, and presumably these prospective residents were struggling to find housing of their own in a very tight real estate market, and still overwhelmingly, they wanted to live only in white communities. Next slide. Other organizations and individuals continued to conduct surveys locally and nationally through the 1950s. One of those individuals was a University of Minnesota sociology professor named Arnold Rose. Together with his students, he conducted a number of surveys assessing public opinions toward racial integration. In 1953, he asked white residents of 8 Minneapolis neighborhoods where there was at least one Black resident about their experiences. One question asked is seen here, quote, "Some time ago, a Negro family moved into this neighborhood. Do you think this hurt property values?" End quote. Public opinion, at least in these neighborhoods, improved slightly from the 1946 state survey, where 64% had believed a Black neighbor would harm property values. But even among those who had Black neighbors for over 10 years, a third of the homeowners found their presence harmed their property value. Next slide, please. A moment ago, Jessica told us Governor Freeman and many other state politicians were not in support of open housing legislation. Their constituents weren't either. 11,000 residents of Minnesota's 5th Congressional District responded when asked by the representative at the time, Walter Judd, quote, "Do you believe Congress should pass at this session additional legislation in the field of civil rights?" End quote. Only 31% of respondents wanted open housing legislation at that time. Next slide. Arnold Rose continued his surveys through the 1950s as the freeways disrupted Minneapolis neighborhoods. 1959, he surveyed the white residents of South Minneapolis who were about to be displaced by 35W about the kind of neighborhood they hoped to relocate to. Despite living in an integrated neighborhood already, 74% of them wanted to live in all-white neighborhoods. Overall, these residents also opposed open housing legislation. For many of them, one possible solution to the shortage of housing for Black people was simply to build more in existing neighborhoods. This solution hardly makes any sense given how many homes were about to be destroyed or had just been destroyed in order to build a freeway through one of those neighborhoods. Over 80% of those surveyed understood their Black neighbors who were displaced had limited options for housing, yet 63% of them still believed that Black people preferred to live in segregated neighborhoods. Many of them seem to believe that in interracial neighborhoods, Black residents would be subjected to, quote, unfriendliness from their white neighbors. And it turns out that was partially correct. For the Taylor family, they faced an uphill battle finding their new home. Back to you, Jacob.
Thank you, Kas. So for all of this, Taylor did not necessarily know all of this, although they probably felt it in their lives. And similarly, they did not know that this village meeting in Morningside had happened. When, a couple days after it, the press asked him about his upcoming move, and Taylor, thinking no one knew about it, denied it, hoping to avoid a publicity circus. Unfortunately, one was coming down on him regardless. When the Taylor family saw of the village meeting and their denial of their purchase in local papers, they knew they had to do something. Marion and Mary enlisted the help of James Tillman, director of the Greater Minneapolis Interfaith Fair Housing Commission, and the commission had been fighting to help open up housing opportunities for people of color throughout the Twin Cities. And Tillman himself had gotten a taste of how dire this situation could be when he moved to Minneapolis to lead the organization in 1959. He contacted over 100 renters unsuccessfully, many of which specifically told him they would not rent to a Black man. Next slide, please. With Tillman's help, the Taylor family became more active. They released a statement and prepared to fight any action the village might take against their move. Simultaneously, with Morningside residents sympathetic to the Taylors to help them drum up support. He worked most closely with Sherman Hasbrook, who Tillman met through a connection in the First Unitarian Society. As a resident in Morningside, Hasbrook was invaluable in finding and increasing support for the Taylors in the neighborhood. Eventually, Hasbrook and several other Morningside residents wrote and circulated a petition on behalf of the Taylors, appealing to Morningside's better nature to welcome them. The petition largely framed the issue as one of publicity. The eyes of the world, it said, were on Morningside, and they needed to do the right thing. Further support came from Edina-Morningside Church, where on January 10th, Reverend Merrill Beal gave a sermon strongly in favor of the Taylors. The petition, which was posted on the doors of the church that Sunday, picked up quite a few more signatures that morning. Of support came from Mayor Ken Joyce, who was Morningside in 1960. To the neighborhood on January 18th, assuring his neighbors that he would not sell his house if the Taylors were to move in. Panic selling, which Mayor Joyce clearly hopes could be avoided, was often an unfortunate consequence of a family of color moving into a white neighborhood. A few families would sell, leading to speculative buying and even more selling, drastically dropping property values. By assuring his neighbors that he would not leave, Ken Joyce hoped to stave off this ahead of the fact and also show his support for the Taylors moving into the neighborhood. Next slide, please. In the end, the Taylors were able to move into Morningside. Despite the freeway and everything that came before and after, they fought and were able to once again find a place for themselves in everything. This victory, as much as it genuinely was a real victory, must have felt hollow at times. For almost the entire 2 decades they lived in Morningside, the Taylors were the only Black family, often the only family of color. As much as they were able to create a life for themselves, it had to have been a lonely one at times. Next slide, please. How easy could it have been for Greg, the only Black at his school, or high school? How isolated did Marion feel, supported by his new neighbors to be sure, but the only Black man in his neighborhood and one of the only few at his job? Who did Mary turn to when she needed to confide or talk about her experience? Who was there for them in all of this? In some ways, we still don't know, but we know they made it. Despite the obstacles placed before them at every step, the Taylors were able to make a home for themselves. This story is an exceptional one, but we know it's not a unique one. Thousands of families were displaced by 35W in Minneapolis alone. One of the goals of our work is to keep illuminating stories like this. How did people react when they found out their house was going to be taken for the freeway? Where could they even move? If your family or someone you know was displaced by 35W, we would love to hear your story. Please tell us what the experience was like, because in many cases we just don't know, and we want to learn, and we can't do it without your help. Thank you.
So we will move into the Q&A section now. And as those of you attending the presentation give some thought to what your own questions will be and enter them in the chat, I'll start out with one of my own. I think all three of you, Jacob, Jessica, and Kas, mentioned education, attempts to educate white Minnesotans in your presentations. Most of the time, it seemed like this was something that kind of stood in the place of policy change, and that maybe was not as effective, or it seemed like you were suggesting something about the effectiveness of education versus policy. Although in other cases, maybe in the case of Edina-Morningside Church, there was some amount of success with educating white Minnesotans. So I just wondered if you could, I think this is a topic that this year, a lot of white Minnesotans have been thinking about educating themselves about racism and educating others. And so I just wondered, based on your historical examples, how important or effective that was, and maybe like what made it effective versus ineffective. Kas, you're the one with your camera on, so I'll start with you.
So I think that is one of the things that Arnold Rose was trying to get at in some of his survey work. And he did a lot of survey work. I haven't tracked all of it down just yet. But I think that there was very much this perception from the people who were doing the surveys were that like, oh, well, if they just understood, but even that last 1959 survey shows there was a lot of cognitive dissonance. among white residents of Minnesota and Minneapolis about like what the actual experiences were. And I don't know that education necessarily would have solved all of those problems, but I think that that was very much the official like recommendation from a lot of this research, was to do education.
It's fascinating. We haven't found, other than that one pamphlet that Kas showed, we haven't found any other educational materials that may have been developed at this period of time on human relations. I tend to read these calls for education as a kind of deferral of the issue entirely. That we're not going to move on legislation because we're elected officials and we know that our constituents are deeply divided on this issue, and therefore calling for education is a convenient excuse to not do anything from a legislative perspective, to not take meaningful action, in my opinion.
Another thing that's come in just in some messages to the panelists is, so this presentation is thinking about the connection between, so one might ask, why does a public history of 35W, that's a project about the freeway, why are you talking about racial segregation in housing? And I think one of the answers to that question that was really clear through this presentation is that racial segregation in housing really limited where people could move if they were displaced. Some people have been messaging us. Also, someone had pulled up the mapping prejudice map, right, and was looking through racial covenant maps or redlining maps. And so for those who haven't been following with us on the last couple of events, I wonder, Denise or Greg, if you could kind of summarize another connection between racial segregation in housing and the freeway that has more to do with decisions about where the freeway could go. It's a very leading question, but would you give us the down and dirty on that connection?
Well, we're piecing this together, but one of the things we've found is that many people are familiar with the redlining maps of other cities and of Minneapolis. Perhaps less familiar is the neighborhood descriptions that the appraisers who created the maps used to justify their color codings. And so one of the interesting things we've found is that along 35W's route, or what would become 35W's route, there was a concern among these appraisers that there was a need for a kind of protection of neighborhoods that were predominantly white or exclusively white at that point in the 1930s from Black people moving west from the old South Side, and that neighborhood groups were being formed to, according to these appraisers, protect from a Negro invasion, so-called. And less than 20 years later, a freeway is built exactly on this line that the redlining map appraisers determined some protection was needed. And in fact, the underwriting manual that the FHA issued to help guide appraisals decisions advised that appraisers should look for a kind of natural protective border between neighborhoods. And if no natural border could be found, that they should look for high-speed traffic arteries. And the people who planned the freeway knew that the freeway would be a barrier, and that barriers weren't necessarily a bad thing if they protected some neighborhoods from what they described as inharmonious uses, or if they protected homogeneous neighborhoods. And in that era, harmonious uses in homogeneous neighborhoods are coded language for white neighborhoods. I saw another attendee was asking about the route to avoid the curve that 35W takes. And initially, the route, the freeway planners considered three routes: one down Cedar, one down Stevens, and a third further west. And And they realized early on that there were two important landmarks that they sought to avoid. One was the Minneapolis Auditorium, and the other was the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So we don't have any indication that there was any kind of advocacy needed on behalf of the museum to avoid its building. But freeway planners saw this early on as something that of course they would avoid.
Next question is for Jacob, who I think is doing the deepest research on the Taylor family. Do you know where the descendants of the Taylors are today, or any way to be in touch with the Taylor family?
No, just a little bit about that. So from what I know, I think Courtney, who is the granddaughter of Marion and Mary Taylor, is living in Los Angeles right now. I think I saw a question about this, and she is the one we're going to be getting in touch with later next month. And I
from Minnesota, and we're hoping that we think Courtney is going to have her father with us when we talk to them. So we're looking forward to that just after Thanksgiving.
So we'll look forward to hearing about that at our next event.
And we're so, one of the reasons we're interested in talking to them is with so much of our work that we're doing on 35W, we have what I describe as a representational challenge. We seek to tell a story about people and their experiences of the freeway, and yet we mostly have photographs of the freeway. And this is a product of essentially the people who created the archives that enable us to research this. And the archives were built and have been maintained by the highway department. And so connecting stories and images of people has been really challenging. So this is something we could help with.
Yeah. Next question. Really, this is a question for Bruce Bremer, who's a team member who's not on the panel today, so someone can respond for him. But do you know how many homes were removed from 35W and how many of those were occupied by people of color versus whites?
There's a spreadsheet. I know that it has just over 1,400 records on it, and it does indicate whether they were wrecked or moved for the ones that we have found out about, but I could not tell you off the top of my head which ones.
It's about 1,000 properties that were taken with the construction of 35W in South Minneapolis, so between 94 and Route 62. How many people lived in those houses? We don't exactly know yet. So we know the property owners' names, but we don't know for houses that were rented how many renters were in them, and we don't know how big the family size was yet. And in terms of the race of the people who occupied the houses, nobody kept these records. The highway department didn't keep them because, again, the law, the Interstate Highway Act didn't require them to keep these kind of records. And we hope to reconstruct these details by piecing together information about people who lived in the houses and connecting them back to 1940 census records, which will hopefully enable us to tell their race, occupation, and educational status.
Thanks. Next question could go to any of you. Maybe I'll throw it to Denise, and if someone else jumps in, they can interrupt you. How does our racist past related to housing continue to affect Black folks in Minnesota, and what can people do today to create true equity? And I would add to that, I know a lot of your research has also been about how the freeway in particular affected and continues to affect the South Side community.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Minnesota and the Twin Cities today have some of the worst racial disparities and some of the worst segregation in predominantly white communities. So this history of racial housing discrimination really has a lasting effect on where people live today, their access to home ownership, the wealth gap that we have between Black and white in Minnesota. In Minnesota, 75% of white households own their own home, and it's only about 23% of Black households. So this history really does have such long-lasting consequences. In terms of what we can do today, I think the first step is to learn about this history. I think the second step is to figure out what policies and legislation and reparations need to be made to communities that were essentially locked out of homeownership, wealth building, access to integrated communities. So it's a great question, and we don't have all the answers, but as a public historian, I think part of our role is to illuminate this history and have larger community conversations about it so that we can figure out what do reparations look like.
Yeah. One request that came in on the chat was for someone to drop a link to a redlining map that might help back up some of what Greg was saying about choices of routes. So I'll leave that to one of you to drop into the chat as I ask the next question. A question about notification and compensation. How were families notified? When were they notified? Were they compensated? How were they compensated for being removed, having their houses removed?
I've looked into this detail most intensively on our team, and I can say that basically homeowners, or I should say property owners, received a letter indicating that their house was being condemned for the construction of the freeway. And it largely proceeded along the court-dictated process of condemnation that Jacob described. Property owners could appear before the court to try to argue that their house wasn't in the public interest to take. This was, as Jacob said, virtually impossible. And then there was a second condemnation hearing that they could attend once they learned how much the state was going to give them for their house based on appraisal. They could make a case that it was worth more money and to provide additional evidence. Property owners were compensated what was determined to be the fair market value of their house based on appraisal. They were not compensated for moving expenses. This was, as I said, this was a court-dictated process of condemnation. They were not compensated for their time to appear in court. They weren't compensated for hiring their own appraisal or for their own legal representation, which many of them felt they had to do. And you know, if you're a homeowner, you know that when you go to sell your house, you know, nobody's going to pay for your draperies that you may have just. If you imagine yourself, your house being condemned for the construction of some project next year, you know, you might not get the value that you put into your new kitchen, or you're not going to get the value that you invested in your garden necessarily. Appraisals don't really pick up those sorts of details often. So many people felt like they were losing money. And many of them felt that they were losing money about 10 or 15% of the value of their total house. So there were a lot of grievances with this condemnation process in South Minneapolis. And in fact, it was so contentious, and people in South Minneapolis protested so strongly to the government, to the governor and other elected officials, that they compelled the highway department to try a different approach to acquiring property, which they called direct buying, which essentially the highway department would meet with property owners and say, you know, what do you think your house is worth? Here's what we think your house is worth. And they would negotiate a price. But direct buying as a tactic didn't start until the construction of Highway 62 began, which followed the construction of Highway 35.
Thanks. Next
And
question.
also on that topic, I know there is a 1966 survey that was a national study of the relocation fees and how they were distributed. Minneapolis is included in that, but I haven't thoroughly gone through it yet. So I'm hoping there's a little bit more information about how federally, like, the relocation funds were distributed as well compared to Minneapolis.
Thank you for adding that. A couple of people have asked about what research you've done into how businesses were affected by this, particularly African-American businesses.
Well, I can start on this. The freeway went through primarily residential neighborhoods. We have seen some evidence of businesses that were directly impacted, but not many. Denise, I'm wondering if you can think of any. How businesses were in the old South Side were affected by this is something we still want to look into. But one of the great challenges of our research is that mainstream newspapers like the Star Tribune, they didn't often report on the experience of Black residents, Black people in the Twin Cities. Resources that might tell us more about this, like the Spokesman Recorder, haven't been digitized. And as much as we've tried to hunt through them for articles, we haven't been successful in that search so far.
I had one more and then I was looking for a redlining map. Sorry, I spaced out while you were talking there, Greg. Another question, and thank you for that, is what you know about this research in other parts of the country. I mean, obviously this freeway issue happened all over. What do other cities know about their own freeway history, and is anyone digging into it in quite the way that you are?
Denise, you want to take a start on that?
Yeah, there's been several different projects happening. Even there's our work is inspired by the work in Rondo in St. Paul, and there's just been amazing grassroots community work there to better understand the impacts of the freeway and to interpret the effects of the freeway on the community throughout time. But yeah, there's different national projects in different areas of the nation who are working on this. Greg, if you could probably speak more about the project that we've been in conversation with.
Oh, yeah. Something that's really interesting is there is a colleague at the University of Richmond in Virginia has received a large grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to make available basically freeway planning documents on a national level for the interstate highway system in the way that he and his colleagues have done for redlining maps. So to the extent that we and many other cities across the country can find their redlining maps and interact with them online, this is a product of this digital research laboratory at University of Richmond. And so it's exciting to see this come together. Denise and I are hoping in the spring to participate in a planning meeting about this. But as far as we know, there is a lot of scholarship about freeway construction for the interstate highway system. And it's well known that communities of color, lower income communities, neighborhoods where people of color lived, were in a sense targeted for the location of freeways for a number of reasons. But exactly what the experience of these communities was like on the ground is less well known. These stories are painted in a kind of broad brushstroke, and as Denise said, Rondo fits into this national literature about the Interstate Highway Program. Many scholars cite it as an example of kind of callous disregard for Black communities on behalf of freeway people who planned and built freeways in the middle of the 20th century.
And that it seems it's so symbolic what you said before about on your search for photos and information about people, you keep finding photos of the freeway, right? It's really clear what was important to the people keeping track of this then. Questions have quieted down and we just have a few minutes left. So I'm going to ask one more of my own, which is what's next? I know you're talking to a Taylor descendant soon. What else are you working on in the coming months? What else should we look forward to hearing about?
Well, I can speak a bit about our oral history project. So we are always looking for people who want to participate and talk with us and are interested in doing an oral history. So as we said, a lot of these archives and documents and newspapers, they don't really tell the perspective from the community's perspective. So we really need to talk with people who have those memories. If you have experience with the freeway, even if it's not the construction of the freeway, if it's just like you live in the neighborhood and you want to share your experience with the freeway now, if your family has experience, if you have any friends who have experience with the freeway who want to talk about it, we'd love to hear from you. And so we've been working on some oral histories with folks. Due to COVID, we're doing those kind of virtually right now, but we can definitely be in conversation about working with you.
Yes, and following up on what Denise just said, we're not just interested in the original construction of 35W. There was a plan to expand and widen 35W that was proposed in the mid-1980s and continued through the early 1990s. And there was major community opposition to this and pushback and organizing around opposing freeway expansion. And that is material that we hope to dig into more in the spring. And we're hopeful that there are more people who remember that we could talk to about that. So if you were part of that organizing to oppose freeway expansion of 35W, we'd love to talk to you. So please get in touch with us.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more from you in the coming months. And I want to thank you all so much for the research that you're doing. I am so honored that we will have this exhibit at our museum and so appreciative of the events that we're doing in the meantime. And for those of you attending, I'd like to thank you for being here. Thank you for those of you who have shared your stories, and those of you who have stories, as Denise and Greg said, please share them. There's a lot to uncover. I think a lot still to be learned. I see one person asking me privately how they can get in touch with us. So if one of you would drop a link to your website in the chat, there's a space there where you can send an email to the team and they'll get back to you to do that oral history. We are recording this, and so we will have this up on the Hennepin History Museum YouTube's channel in a week or two. We will announce on social media when that's up. Greg, one more question for you. There's a question coming in on the chat. Are you interested in stories of people? I'm just going to read it out loud because I haven't had time to read it to myself. Are you interested in stories from anyone who lived along the route that 35W took? My aunt and uncle owned a grocery store that was located on 28th Street where 35 crosses it and were displaced by it. I think I can say your answer is yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We're absolutely interested in that.
And another person messaging me privately about remembering the expansion and wanting to get in touch with you about that. So everyone, Greg just put that link in the chat. If you have stories, please follow that link to the Public History of 35W website and submit a request there. I'm going to wrap things up. We're so glad that you could make it. Can't wait to see you again at the next event. Be well and take care. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks for everyone who came.
Thank you.